Good evening. Welcome to the Library of Virginia. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our fourth event in our 2025 Carole Weinstein Author Series. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Tonight's program is made possible with generous support through the Carole Weinstein Endowment for Virginia Authors of the Library of Virginia Foundation. The Carole Weinstein Author Series supports literary arts, bringing both new and well-known authors to the Library of Virginia. The series focuses on Virginia authors and Virginia subjects across all genres. We are so grateful to Carole, who's with us this evening, for this incredible support to the library and longstanding belief in the library's work. So thank you, Carole, so much. Now, you too can support the Library of Virginia's work after this event. If you wish to visit the table outside, there's some staff members that can help with that. Or if you'd like to visit lvafoundation.org. Obviously, the foundation is here to support the Library of Virginia as a public-private partnership, and every bit of private support really matters right now more than ever, as you can imagine, so thank you. There will be a book signing after tonight's program in the lobby. I encourage you to visit the Virginia shop to purchase your book if you have not done so already. And with that, I would like to introduce Carole Weinstein to introduce tonight's author and book. So thank you so very much for coming this evening.
I especially wanted to just make an effort to be here. I loved Scattered Fugitive Things, and I didn't expect to. So for those of you who are wondering when you pick this up and you see that a third of it is footnotes and index and bibliography and annotations, never fear. The writing of this book is extraordinary. It's like a scavenger hunt. Really and truly, that's what I thought of as I read it. I felt like the gathering of all these archival materials, how difficult that was, and then finding the way to organize them, the decades that took to do that. It just read like, some sort of mystery that you're looking for the solution in the end, the who did it. Historian who writes about collections and how they change our world. Now that is a big idea. And it made me pause because that's a lot to take in. It's important. She's an associate professor of English and history at the University of Delaware, where she teaches African American literature, archival studies, and public humanities. I'm going to turn it now over to the woman who wrote the book. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much to the Library of Virginia and to Anne McCreary, who organized the program, and to the Carole Weinstein Author Series. Thank you all for having me. And thank you for that very kind introduction. The book is timely, I think, in a couple of ways. One, celebratory, because it is the centennial of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It is the centennial in these years of the Harlem Renaissance, and this is really a Harlem Renaissance story. So we are celebrating those centennials. It's also timely for less celebratory reasons as well, because we're in a moment where, in too many places across the country, Black history is being removed from library shelves. Removed from library shelves and removed from classroom curricula. As a teacher, it's my job to protect the right of students to learn the truth and complexities of American history. And I imagine there are other teachers in the room, and I share that duty with you. As a historian, I want to understand how the current moment that we're in, the current moment of book banning, is part of a much longer history of struggle over what counts as history and who gets to tell the stories of the past. So tonight I want us to travel back 100 years ago when almost no public libraries or classrooms had Black history books in their collections. Who changed that? Who made it possible to teach Black history, to put it on library shelves? And what can we learn from the stories of the people who made those changes that might help us today as we wrestle with efforts to rewrite museum exhibits or to remove books from collections? In the opening decades of the 20th century, a remarkable group of Black bookworms, bibliophiles, librarians, scrapbook makers, and curators built the country's first set of permanent collections documenting African American and African history. The collections that they built took shape across the country in towns large and small. At grand libraries in the north, such as the one pictured here, which is the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library in Chicago, or at the 135th Street Branch Library in Harlem, which is now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in a much larger building on the same site. These collections also took place in the parlors of Black bibliophiles, such as Jessie Moreland, who is pictured here. They took shape on the campuses of Black colleges and universities, such as at Fisk University, pictured here in Nashville. And they also took shape in small repositories across the South, such as the tiny Gainsborough Library in Roanoke. It would be impossible to imagine the study of American history today without these collections across the country, which were built by risk-taking thinkers who understood the value of Black history at a time when it was not popular. Scattered and Fugitive Things tells the story of 6 of these risk-takers. And just to give you an overview of the book before we dive in, it begins in Harlem in the 1910s and 1920s in the parlors of bookmen, the bibliophile Arturo Schomburg and the scrapbook maker Alexander Gumby, both pictured here. These opening chapters ask how collectors imagined Black archives when there weren't any. What should be kept and why? The book then follows a gendered shift in the keeping of Black records in the 1920s and 1930s as collections moved out of these private parlors and into the reading rooms of public and college libraries on HBCU campuses or historically Black colleges and universities. And there they were curated by professional library women like Virginia Lee in Roanoke and Dorothy Porter at Howard University, both pictured here. These middle chapters are about the risks that collectors took to make these archives accessible. And the book then ends with the question of how archiving or collecting is embedded in Black public life and politics. And it focuses on the work in the 1940s of Vivian Harsh, a librarian in Chicago, and the historian L.D. Reddick back in New York. Before I dive into a couple of their stories, I should note that while collecting flourished in the early 20th century at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, it did not begin at that moment. The collectors who built these institutions in the early 20th century were not the first to document Black history, not by a long shot. They were building on generations of memory work from the 19th century and before. For example, in 1853, at the Colored National Convention, delegates passed a resolution that called for a committee to collect all facts, all laws and historical records and biographies of the colored people, and all books by colored authors. They shall have for the safe keeping of these documents a library with a reading room and museum. And that resolution never came to pass in a physical location, but it shows you the long-standing dream of building collections that would be accessible to the public. In 1895, Victoria Earle Matthews gave a speech called The Value of Race Literature, and she called for an earnest and systematic effort to procure and preserve for transmission to our successors the records, books, and various publications already produced by us. So again, articulating this dream of Black collections available to the public. Perhaps the most famous early Black historian was Carter G. Woodson, who in 1926, 100 years ago, founded what was then called Negro History Week, the precursor to what is now Black History Month. Woodson knew that there were uncollected records everywhere, and especially in the South, in family basements and attics. Woodson inspired a growing number of collectors and librarians across the country to gather this material and to create research collections that would be accessible to communities. By 1940, there were at least 24 special collections devoted to Black history and culture. They were all located either at Black colleges or in Black-serving public branch libraries, and they were primarily staffed by Black women. Indeed, it's no coincidence that these new collections sprang up in the era when Black women were increasingly joining the ranks of professionally trained librarians. This is a drawing here on the left that was created in 1925 by Vinold Rees for Elaine Locke's famous Harlem Renaissance anthology, The New Negro. It's just titled The Librarian, and it's not a portrait of any one individual, but rather a composite inspired by Harlem's librarians who Rees met. I chose it for the cover of the book because it beautifully captures the spirit and the fierceness of the Harlem Renaissance librarians who fought for Black history. The first collections of Black literature and history took shape under difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions, at a moment when both scholarly and popular accounts and popular culture cast doubt on the very idea that Black history existed. And it was a moment when the act of reading could require secrecy. Arturo, or Arthur Schomburg, for example, grew up in Puerto Rico under Spanish colonial rule, when it was considered seditious to read the works of his favorite revolutionary poet, Rafael Serra. So Schomburg recalled that when he was a boy in the late 1880s, he had to read Serra in secret, or what he called under darkness. He migrated to the United States in the early 1890s, and he came of age just as the first state archives emerged in Alabama and Mississippi to enshrine Confederate memory. And as an adult, Schomburg honed his collecting habit when the U.S. was policing its color line so ferociously that 8 million or more African Americans could not enter their hometown libraries. So in his manifesto, called The Negro Digs Up His Past, Schomburg argued that it was these forms of suppression that gave rise to a collecting imperative forged by empire and exclusion. He proclaimed in this essay, quote, that the American Negro was compelled by the very pressure of the present to become the most enthusiastic antiquarian of them all. In other words, it was the pressures of the present that inspired the search for history. With each acquisition that Schomburg made, including a copy of the books that he had once been forbidden to read as a child, including the poetry of Rafael Serra, Schomburg was rebuking these prohibitions on Black knowledge. Having been told over and over that there was no Black history, or if there was, that he couldn't read it, Schomburg and his generation of collectors defiantly created archives. Defiantly, but also exuberantly. It's important to remember that archive building was also a practice not only of protest, but also of celebration. One of my favorite passages that I came across in doing research on Schomburg and his generation of collectors was from 1922 from the Negro World newspaper. And I'll put that passage up here. It was a profile of Schomburg that described him like this. Schomburg has a penchant for books, rare books, and if he should suddenly die with his overcoat on, it will be found that the pockets will contain catalogs from London, Leipzig, Italy, England, and the USA, all marked up by this old bookworm at the places where there is any reference to the African or Negro. This vignette captures both the zeal of Schomburg's penchant, the idea that he's walking around at all times with his pockets stuffed with book catalogs, but it also captures the community's esteem for his obsessive venture. From cabinets stuffed with ephemera to library stacks crowded with books, Schomburg and other Black collectors of the early 20th century created abundance where other people had seen absence. They wanted to show that Black history was everywhere. And they did that not only by amassing an unprecedented amount of material, but also by putting it on display, creating exhibitions, creating beautiful reading rooms, publishing bibliographies and reading lists. These collections then were alive in the present. They're not just around bequeathing history to later historians who will come around and do research. They were alive and important to the communities that built them and supported them. They were community spaces that were vibrant, experimental, and deeply part of Black social life. To do this work, bibliophiles and collectors had to see abundance where others saw absence, as I said. They had to see value where others saw detritus. So their work challenged the devaluation of both the Black past and present. They also had to take risks that were at once material and intellectual, to provide access to Black texts. They challenged laws of segregation and sedition to protect the right for their collections to exist. And that work sometimes hinged on acts of fugitivity or defiance, as we shall see. So to dig into those practices of value and risk, I'm going to take us inside two scenes in the book, each of which will route us through Virginia in one way or another. Arturo Schomburg migrated to New York from Puerto Rico in 1891. At age 17, he already knew two forms of literary exile: the exclusion of Blackness from Puerto Rican cultural heritage and the banning of anti-imperialist texts by colonial forces. He often told the story that when he was a schoolboy, his teacher told him that, quote, "the Negro has no history." So those experiences of exclusion converged to turn Schomburg into a collector. He defiantly vowed to gather, as he said, whatever is meritorious pertaining to the history and development of the Negro. He already grasped the stakes of assembling a library at a young age because he knew that the mere possession of a book or a record could constitute rebellion, and from the colonial point of view, sedition. He understood that libraries were powerful and therefore could be considered threats by those in power. His budding determination to collect found encouragement in New York when he arrived among the community of Cuban and Puerto Rican expatriates that he joined. At the turn of the century, Schomburg also met his mentor and longtime friend, John Edward Bruce, who's pictured standing in the center in the back row of this portrait of the Negro Society for Historical Research. Bruce had a sizable library. He shared Schomburg's love of poetry, and he had written extensively about Black history. And through Bruce, Schomburg found a network of book collecting friends who included John W. Cromwell in Washington, D.C., who was a teacher, and W.C. Bolivar in Philadelphia. They're both pictured here in silhouette with Schomburg. The correspondence, the letters between these bibliophiles, gives us a sense of what it was to be a collector in this moment. And the correspondence bears witness to the pleasures that they took in collecting. "With my morning mail came the Royal Almanac of Haiti," Schomburg wrote to Cromwell, and he described the feeling of pleasure that comes over me to have this memento. Schomburg also described it as difficult to find what he called the buried facts of Black history, and so he worked together with these bibliophile friends to share the knowledge they were amassing. Schomburg worked in a mailroom on Wall Street, and he would often spend his lunch breaks out hunting the old bookshops and bookstalls of Lower Manhattan. And every time he found something, he would go back to his office and immediately write to his friends about what he had found. This group of bookworms called themselves DOFOB, which stood for Damned Old Fools on Books. In these letters, they not only described the pleasures of collecting, they also discussed at great length what things cost, because the question of value was at the very center of this project. Schomburg boasted on one occasion, for example, of acquiring a West African dictionary for $1, while lamenting on another day that my pocket was not equal to my mind. Schomburg and his comrades valued Black texts, and in doing so, they contradicted popular and scholarly accounts that framed Blackness as barren of historical worth. But there was a paradox at the heart of their work. Most Black bibliophiles, like Schomburg, lacked significant personal wealth. These were not rich men, and they would not have been able to afford high prices. They usually paid a quarter or 50 cents, maybe a few dollars, for secondhand books. Their ability to collect thus depended on the market's devaluation of Black texts. When Schomburg acquired a first edition of Phillis Wheatley's poetry, he exulted at the unlikely feat because Wheatley's poetry was one of the few objects of Black authorship that white collectors also wanted. And when Schomburg faced wealthy competitors for such items, he nearly always got outbid. So the letters are often about stories of lament, where he's outbid for an item that he really wanted. All of that context takes us to a day in February of 1916, when Schomburg wrote to Elaine Locke about an upcoming auction of what was called a splendid collection of publications on slavery from the library of the late Joseph Bryan of Richmond, Virginia. These were to be sold at the Anderson Auction Gallery in New York. Schomburg had his eye on a copy of Morgan Godwin's 1680 book called The Negroes and Indians Advocate. And in his letter to Locke about this rare object, he offered several reflections on the price of Black history. And I'm going to, bear with me, I'm going to read the whole passage from the letter because I think it's really interesting. So he said to Locke, "Saturday I visited the Andersons' galleries and had a view of the rarities. By the way, who is this Bryan to have gathered so interesting a lot of Negroes' books in Richmond, Virginia? I have a few bids on the rare items, but I'm afraid the collectors are up in arms. Now is the time to buy anti-slavery items. The prices are cheap, dirt cheap. I paid 30 cents for 2 volumes that belonged to Phillis Wheatley's collection, inscribed September 24th, 1774. But my holograph letter of Toussaint Louverture I consider a very priceless desiderata. I will keep you posted on the Bryan sale. I have a bid of $7 on the Godwin item printed in 1680, one of the rarest and choicest Negro items in existence. Mr. Harper, a collector, has a perfect copy for which he charges the sum of $100. So my chances for putting my hands on Godwin is very doubtful." In this letter, Schomburg is moving between many different emotions: regret at the prohibitive cost of some items that he would want, bafflement at the dirt cheap price of others, and his sense of wonder about owning certain objects like Toussaint Louverture's autographed letters. A shrewd buyer, Schomburg knew to temper his emotions with stealth, taking advantage of the market's indifference whenever he could, because he knew that if wealthier bidders got up in arms, as he said in this letter, meaning that they took notice, he stood little chance at securing his desired object. Although he planned to offer $7 for Godwin at the Bryan auction, which was a high price for him, he felt that his chances were doubtful. On the day of the Bryan sale, Schomburg entered the auction gallery, and he may have been the only Black person in the auction gallery, or certainly one of few if there were others. And he entered the auction gallery not just at a financial disadvantage. He also entered the gallery philosophically at odds with a market that did not account for Black collectors' theories of value. And here we're just going to get really nerdy for a second, but I'm assuming that if you all are here for a history talk on a beautiful day, that you can get nerdy with me for a minute. In the tools of the antiquarian book trade, such as American Book Prices Current, Schomburg could occasionally get a sense of the going price for a Black authored text if it was very famous or rare, like Phillis Wheatley's poems. So, for example, there was a worn first edition of Wheatley sold for $3 in 1911, and a copy of her poems that was treated by a famous bookbinder sold for $35 in 1920. But most works of Black authorship traded far below the threshold of $3 that would merit an entry in Book Prices Current. So the tools that most collectors used weren't of particular use for the collectors who were interested in Black history, and they had to make their own systems of valuation. One of Schomburg's fellow bookworms, the bookstore owner George Young, for example, once remarked that copies of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies were, he said, worth their weight in gold. But that appraisal had nothing to do with the rare book market's valuation, because Douglass's life and times didn't garner a single entry in book prices current between 1900 and 1926, which meant it never sold for more than $3 at auction. So there was a great discrepancy between the way the market valued Black texts and the way Black bibliophiles spoke of their treasures as worth their weight in gold. Now, despite his pessimism, Schomburg won the item that he coveted, paying $5.25 for Godwin's The Negroes and Indians Advocate. And this photograph is of the actual copy that he bought that day in 1916, and it is still in the collection that's named for him at the New York Public Library. Schomburg, in fact, netted 20 items from the Bryan sale. Pretty good for a novice, he told Locke afterward. But it was the Godwin he was most excited about. Just as Schomburg in his youth had defied restrictions on literacy by secretly reading the revolutionary poet Raphael Serra, his purchase of this item rebuked its previous ownership in remarkable fashion, although Schomburg seemed unaware of the book's provenance. Remember in his letter when Schomburg asked Locke, "Who is this Bryan?" to have gathered so interesting a lot of Negro books? The answer to that question, had Schomburg known, might have left him feeling either triumphant or unsettled. Although Schomburg was unfamiliar with the name Joseph Bryan, it's a name that I'm sure you in Richmond know well. The statue of Joseph Bryan, of course, was the last of the Confederate statues removed from Monroe Park in 2020. Though many of you are already familiar with Bryan's biography, he was briefly a founder of the Virginia Historical Society, an industrialist and newspaper publisher who wielded significant influence in Virginia state politics. And he used that influence in part to actively oppose Black suffrage and civil rights after the Civil War. He had grown up on the Eagle Point plantation, the son of slaveholder and wealthy planter John Randolph Bryan. After fighting for the Confederacy, Joseph Bryan became a partisan of what was called the Lost Cause, the idea that the noble Confederacy had deserved to win the war and certainly deserved to be honored in history. So along with his wife, the preservationist Isabel Stewart Bryan, he populated the South, or helped to populate the South, with Confederate monuments and memorials. He was a reader and collector of Virginia history, and as a result, amassed an impressive library that documented the history of slavery and abolition in the region. But he didn't collect these books because he sympathized with those who were enslaved. As noted by James Lindgren in the Dictionary of Virginia Biography, Joseph Bryan wrote toward the end of his life that, quote, "The older I get, the more I admire the old civilization that made patriots and heroes out of the white people and civilized human beings out of the cannibals of Africa." So Schomburg rejoiced in winning his bid on the Negroes and Indians Advocate, but he may not have fully appreciated the extent to which his acquisition of this object radically reframed its context. Godwin's proto-abolitionist text moved from the bookshelves of Bryan, a white supremacist bibliophile who saw slavery as beneficent in practice, to the bookshelves of Schomburg, who was a fervent defender of Black rights and who lionized slavery's insurrectionists. He once named Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and John Brown as among those historical figures he most revered. So the scene of Schomburg buying and reframing Joseph Bryan's books captures this work of revaluation that Black bibliophiles were undertaking. As they expertly navigated a market that devalued Black history, they were assembling equipment for struggle, or what Schomburg called powder with which to fight our enemies. They saw book collecting as part of a struggle for racial justice. In the hands of Black bibliophiles, these texts conjured possibilities that the market or previous owners, such as Joseph Bryan, could never have foreseen. Schomburg imagined the books on his shelf as what he called the sleep of the just, and the library, for him, was a site of anticipated justice. Now, the next scene I want to highlight takes us to the tiny Gainsborough Library in Roanoke. Maybe some of you have been there. The story of the Gainsborough Library begins in 1920, just 4 years after the sale of Joseph Bryan's books. In 1920, in Roanoke, a remarkable thing happened, which was that 800 people registered to use an imagined library that did not yet exist. The state of Virginia had just passed a new law that authorized the formation of public libraries. And although the law didn't mention segregation directly, Black residents of Roanoke knew from previous experience how the law would unfold. They knew that the city would make plans to build one library, and it would be for white people only. So they sprang into action and formed what they called a colored branch library movement. They raised money for books, and in 1920, they staged a mock library registration event, during which hundreds of adults and children signed up to use a hypothetical, quote, colored library if the city would build one. So they asked for library cards in a city that could not imagine them as readers. And the campaign worked. Segregated Roanoke belatedly agreed to provide funds for not one, but 2 libraries. And the Gainsborough Library, also known as the Colored Branch, opened on December 14, 1921, on the ground floor of the Oddfellows building. It was one of the first branch libraries for Black readers in the South. I think it was the sixth library to open. It followed the model established by a groundbreaking duo of Black librarians in Louisville, Kentucky, Thomas Fountain Blue and Rachel Harris, who argued that every branch library should be a center of education and a place of culture. There were no training programs open to Black librarians in the South, so Louisville sent one of its own to train Ella Bowden, who was Gainsborough's first librarian. Bowden set up the library as Gainsborough's intellectual headquarters, and for 3 decades, it was the only public place where Black residents in Roanoke could check out a book. And you can see one of those checkout cards here. Yeah, you remember those. I remember those. Readers at the Gainsborough Library celebrated one of the very first Negro History Weeks, and the library's small collection included works like James Weldon Johnson's Book of American Negro Poetry and Jessie Fawcett's novel, There Is Confusion. This was the literary and activist world that shaped Virginia Dare Young, pictured here on the left next to her mother. And this photo comes from the collection of her family, Dr. Curtis Reeves and Virginia Young Reeves Scheck-Snyder, and I'm grateful to them for sharing their family photos. Virginia Dare Young was born in 1906 in West Virginia, the daughter of Robert and Lula Young, who's pictured here, Roanokers who had briefly moved west to a coal mining camp. The Youngs returned to Roanoke in the 1910s, and young Virginia took full advantage of what her community had built for her. Her parents had grown up without access to a library or to a high school education. But thanks to the activism of her community, Virginia Lee was among the first young people in the city to have access to both. Teacher Lucy Addison had fought for the right of Black students in Roanoke to receive a secondary education, and Virginia Young thus graduated as valedictorian of the first accredited high school class for Black students in the city. A year earlier, at age 16, Virginia Young gave a speech at the Gainsborough Library's 2nd anniversary celebration. And it might have been at the Gainsborough Library that she first encountered the work of Jessie Fawcett, who would become her hero. The hard-won victories of her parents' generation to create educational programs and spaces made it possible for Virginia Young, after graduation, to enroll 200 miles away at the Hampton Institute. On Hampton's beautiful campus, she encountered the Huntington Memorial Library, an impressive building that had been designed to provoke awe. Having watched her community in Roanoke fight for a reading space, she learned at Hampton what the full possibilities of such a space might be. She immersed herself in the George Peabody collection of 3,000 volumes of Black literature and history, and she joined community members for literary events in the Leonora Herron Room for Pleasure Reading. She enrolled in the Hampton Library School, which was the first academic program for Black librarians in the South. And there she became connected to this national network of Black bibliophiles and curators when Hampton hosted a conference on Black library service in 1927, and she might have also been inspired by Schomburg, who she met in 1930 at Fisk University for a conference to celebrate the opening of the new library there. So there's this moment when the older generation of bibliophile meets the younger generation of Black bibliophile. Virginia Young returned to Roanoke fueled by what she had seen and by this powerful intellectual network. And she became Gainsborough's librarian in 1928 under her married name, Virginia Lee. She set to work remaking the literary world she had experienced at Hampton and Fisk. She launched the Jessie Fawcett Reading Club, named in honor of the novelist and editor she admired. The club's members included teachers, cooks, beauty operators, nurses, and the wives of rail yard workers. And they met twice a month to discuss current events and to discuss books, such as Elaine Locke's recently published The New Negro. So there she would have encountered Schomburg's manifesto on digging up the past. Lee described the group's meeting as a source of both intellectual and aesthetic pleasure, but the Fawcett Club grew into a powerful, if quiet, political force in Roanoke. By the 1930s, the Gainsborough Library had become crowded in its original space, its small storefront. And there was flooding every time it rained. Lee recalled that there were rats in the floodwaters. And she needed to get the collection into a better building. So she mobilized the Fawcett Club at a moment in the 1930s when two sets of historical forces were converging. The 1930s, we might not think of it now because we tend to think of the civil rights movement as happening, in the 50s and 60s. But in Virginia, it's the 1930s that really begin a voting rights push. And it was a decade of voting rights activism across the state. It was also a decade of infrastructure building funded by federal relief programs during the Great Depression. The city of Roanoke proposed a municipal bond initiative for several infrastructure projects using that federal funding in 1938. And as part of its initiative, it wanted to build a new central library. But once again, it left Black readers out of the equation. That exclusion created a political opening for Black Roanoke to test its new powers at the ballot box. Fawcett Club members formed a coalition with Black voter leagues, the NAACP, and several women's clubs. And for many years, as the city was trying to pass its bond proposal, this group made it known that Black Roanokers were organized and they would turn out to support the initiative if the ballot included funding for a new Gainsborough Library building. After its first attempt to win approval for municipal bonds failed, white city officials realized that they needed the support of Black voters, and so begrudgingly they designated $20,000 out of a total of $170,000 to build a colored branch building. After this agreement, the bond initiative passed in 1940, and it was one of Black Roanoke's first political victories. This is the new building. It still stands today. It's still the Gainsborough Branch Library. And it opened with great fanfare on May 10th, 1942. It was a tribute to Lee's persistence and to the political coalition of Black readers that she had pulled together. The new library included the collection of Black literature and history that Lee had been slowly expanding since 1928. She had built this collection in part by soliciting material from famous artists like the vocalist Marian Anderson and the composer W.C. Handy and the writer Langston Hughes. She would ask these artists to donate a memento of historical significance to be placed in the library. And she also asked elders in the community to search their homes for books that they could donate, so that by 1942, her collection held several hundred volumes on Black history and by Black authors. She drew attention to it through small exhibits and displays in the library. But however modest in scope that may sound, even those displays tested the limits of what white city officials would tolerate. Nearly as soon as she became branch librarian, Lee recounted that she received warnings about what she should not do. When she displayed books on Black accomplishments, city officials told her to slow the pace, or in another version of the story, not to put those books out. But Lee made a quiet habit of disregarding those warnings. Now, Lee was what was sometimes called in that period a good book lady. She taught the Golden Rule Bible class at the First Baptist Church. She beautified the city with the garden clubs, and she ruled the library with a strict hand. But the story that makes her famous tells us that good book ladies like Lee were not just good at keeping books. They were also good when they had to be at keeping secrets. And when needed, they were good at breaking rules. Soon after the new building opened in 1942, the city again rebuked Lee, and this time they threatened to destroy her collection and her job along with it. According to a well-known anecdote that circulates in Roanoke, at some point in the 1940s, city officials, and it might have been the city council, but I suspect it was probably the library director, once more warned Lee against collecting or displaying Black cultural materials. She was told to remove offending books from the library's shelves and that she could lose her job if she did not comply. And in the act that has made Lee a local legend, she responded by appearing to comply without actually doing so. She moved the offending books to the library's basement, where she hid them and provided secret access. According to her successor, Carla Lewis, who heard the story from Lee, when a patron wanted something, she'd go and get it and bring it up to them. She continued to make public space for Black knowledge, but this time she had to do it underground. In disobeying the city's demand, her career as a librarian and as a proper book lady suddenly may have had much more in common with her father's work, who managed a Prohibition-era pool hall, than she would have ever imagined. Like other Black branch librarians in the South, Lee adhered carefully to what historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham calls the politics of respectability. Indeed, another popular story in Roanoke is that Lee made children wash their hands before handling any of the books in the library. But what city officials wouldn't have known is that she might have been asking people to wash their hands upstairs in order to use books that were secretly downstairs. The same reverence toward books that caused her to reprimand young children and their dirty hands underlined her determination to save the books from destruction. She knew that to protect the collection entailed a risk, but she held firm. If it was going to cost me my job, that's the way it would have to be, she said. Now, when I first learned about Virginia Lee, it was because of the story of her collection's basement exile, as a local reporter put it. But when I went to Roanoke to learn more, I soon realized that while this was the most famous story about Lee, it was also the least documented. The library board's records from this period haven't survived. If city council members were the ones who pressured Lee, they would have been unlikely to commit that threat to their minutes because they usually went into closed-door executive sessions whenever issues pertaining to race were discussed. That kept it off the record. Lee, too, would have avoided creating a paper trail because it might have incriminated her or others. So the fact is, we don't know many details about the city's threat to Lee's collection, about exactly when that happened and which materials they wanted her to discard. But as a historian, I look for clues, and so here's what I think might have happened. 3 months after the new Gainsborough Library building opened, Lee received a significant addition to the collection, a donation of 24 Black history books from A.E. Lichtman, who was the white owner of a regional chain of Black performance venues and theaters. A photographer arrived to document the donation, and the Norfolk Journal and Guide twice ran this picture and a brief story with the headline, "Lichtman Theater Gives Books." The photograph features Lee standing with Emmett P. Neighbors, who was the manager of the Virginian Theater and who presented the books on behalf of Lichtman. These books, the story announced, would sit in a designated section of the library to be called the Lichtman Shelf on Negro History. Now, there's evidence of these books still in the collection today because Lee marked them with a notation, "Gift of A.E. Lichtman," near the inner hinge of each book. 10 of these books remain traceable, and most were published by Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Now, Lee already had several books in the collection by Woodson, so why would these additions suddenly trigger the city's wrath? The appearance of the Lichtman Shelf on Negro history coincided with a crescendo of statewide civil rights activity that reached the Roanoke area precisely in 1942, and that involved Lichtman, neighbors, and the Fawcett Reading Club, thus conspicuously drawing the Gainsborough Library into the fray. While Virginia had long served as a testing ground for civil rights legislation, and Richmond was often at the center of that, about bus and train segregation and equal pay for teachers, few of those early civil rights cases ever touched Roanoke in the southwest corner of the state. But the NAACP's 1942 organizing drive was statewide, and it swept up Roanoke and no doubt alarmed the city's white leadership. Lichtman was a lifetime member and donor to the NAACP. Neighbors, the one pictured in the newspaper story, chaired the local NAACP campaign, along with Justina Spencer, who was a leader of the Fawcett Club. So in this context, perhaps Lee's plan to label a shelf for Negro history and name it for one of the civil rights movement's white patrons had put city leaders on edge. Lee had for years carefully avoided media attention, but with regional newspaper coverage now highlighting her library's ties to civil rights activists, she may have crossed one of the lines that Black Roanokers were warned not to cross. Whether or not this is the reason that Lee's collection had to go underground, what's always struck me is the fact that Lee would risk her livelihood to protect this particular collection. In the book, I write about other Black history collections in Harlem, in Chicago, in DC, in Nashville, at Tuskegee, and they were all larger and finer than Virginia Lee's very modest collection. Lee's collection didn't include any Phyllis Wheatley's. It certainly didn't include any text from 1680, like Morgan Godwin's The Negroes and Indians Advocate that Schomburg bought from Joseph Bryan's library. So if you had been a confidant of Virginia Lee in 1942 and she had asked you for advice about what to do, you might have reasonably told her not to risk her job for the books in the Gainsborough Library, because the collection she was protecting was small and fairly replaceable. So why did she take the risk? To Lee, the books were essential to defend. It was an effort I absolutely refused to deviate from, she insisted. And her adamance captures the urgency of preserving Black history then, and I would argue now. She said, "I wanted to keep our children mindful that we have had leaders in our race who are worthy of being honored and looked up to. In a city that so often tried to quell the ambitions and spirits of young Black people, Lee wanted to build a collection that allowed young readers to imagine themselves as Negro makers of history, to echo the title of one of the books that Lee had protected." After moving her collection to the basement, Lee waited out the threat until she could safely bring the books back upstairs and return them to the shelves. In the early 1950s, the Roanoke Public Library desegregated, and Lee kept collecting, adding 1,000 or more books to the collection. Until her retirement, she said almost nothing on record about the opposition that she had faced early in her career, and she kept quiet about the act of fugitivity that had saved her collection. But finally, in 1970, just as she was leaving the city's payroll, after more than 4 decades of service, she revealed the story to the Roanoke Times. And in 1982, when the collection was officially named in her honor, she recorded the story on a reel-to-reel audio tape. She made sure that her story survived. She understood that the struggle to preserve spaces of Black knowledge had not ended with her victory in 1942 or with the arrival of racial integration a decade later. She reiterated a principle that had long guided her, an unwavering belief that her community had an underdocumented history worth taking risks to save. There are bigger and more famous collections of Black history elsewhere, but the one Virginia Lee built is among my favorites that I've written about because it represents the persistence of these small collections across the South that made space for Black knowledge inside of cities and civic systems that tried in every way possible to deny access to it. These collections were at once foundational and fugitive. They shaped Black life upstairs in public, and when necessary, underground in exile. In short, the makers of this founding set of Black libraries and archives a century ago left behind not only an abundance of paper, but also a model of intellectual and civic practice, one that refuses to see Black history constrained or threatened, and out of that refusal, make something new. It's a model that we still need today. Thank you. Thank you. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I hope we have time for a few questions.
We'll take a few. We're a little over
great.
time, but we'll take a few.
Great. So in the back, I see a hand.
Over the back.
I'll make this quick. Thank you so much for that. That was inspiring, and I am touched. My emotions going every which way. So my life was framed by those books. I used to run a little phone company called Verizon. I'm on the board here. Now I run this little media company that's having a little fun, doing Tony-winning shows and things like that. But it's because of these very books that made the difference. I mean, most of us sit in this room and see these lights, or the lights that light up our churches or our businesses, and have no idea that the person who invented the part that glows is the Black guy whose family's from Virginia. It's a travesty. But when I learned about that in engineering at Virginia Tech, I went from flunking out to the to the dean's list, to the board of directors, just because I started reading the right books. Education can be expensive, but I know ignorance is more expensive. So that's all preamble for my question. What is the price we pay for not being more aware of our own stories and everyone else's stories?
I think you answered that question in the preamble by demonstrating the value of these collections. And I think it's stories like that, and there's so many stories like that. The actor Ossie Davis, he worked in one of these libraries at Howard as an undergraduate student. He worked in the Moreland collection at Howard. There's so many stories. James Baldwin said that the Schomburg collection saved his life. So there's so many stories like yours, and I think those are the demonstration of both the value of these collections, but also they demonstrate the cost, right, to people when these stories aren't accessible. We're in a moment now that's echoing the same kinds of threats to Black history that Schomburg and Virginia Lee and the others that I chronicle in the book, that they faced as well. And so I do think that their stories can be informative for us in undertaking some of the same battles that they had to fight a century ago.
So could you offer us a roadmap of how we deal with libraries taking books off the shelves specific to civil rights and slavery? How do we, as regular folk, fight against that or deal with that?
I don't think there is a roadmap. And I think there's lots of folks in the room who are in that fight right now. So I won't claim to have the answers to that. I don't think there's a roadmap. I think we're going to lose a lot of the battles along the way. But I do think that as ordinary citizens and users of libraries, that our voices are really important, both for shoring up the folks who work in libraries, letting them know what we appreciate about the collections, and that we don't want books to be removed from collections. They need to hear that because they're hearing a lot of calls. They're getting a lot of calls, right, to pull books from shelves. They need to understand that their constituents are behind them protecting those collections. So even if it seems like someone might not care what you have to say, actually they do. And also voicing those opinions in public, right? Letters to the editor, showing up at library board meetings or school board meetings. All of that actually really does matter. And I think it matters on the local level right now more than ever, because sometimes local institutions are insulated to a certain degree from what's happening at the federal level. It depends on what state you're in, of course. But if Black collectors a century ago had relied on the federal government collecting Black history, wouldn't have survived, right? The success of their venture a century ago was because they worked in autonomous spaces, in local spaces, and they were not waiting, right, for national recognition of these stories. So I think it's really important to be doing this work everywhere and to do it at the local level. I was in Florida last spring to talk about the book, and Florida has been, in some ways, the blueprint for what's going on nationally in terms of erasing Black history from school curricula and libraries. And actually, what I encountered was a fierceness, right, among folks in the community that teachers, librarians, users of libraries, community folks who had been kind of empowered by the fight that they've been in for several years, that the teachers saying, this is what I do, this is my job, my obligation to teach this history, and they're gonna have to fire me before I stop teaching it. So I really took a lot of inspiration from that several years into these kinds of battles over book bans, folks on the ground in Florida are just redoubling their efforts.
Hi, thanks for being here. You mentioned respectability briefly. I had a question about collection development. Was there ever any pressure or thought around collecting materials that reflected Black life in a specific way? Or were they open to and felt comfortable to collecting things that represented kind of the good, bad, and the ugly? Interested in knowing if, a lot of, especially during that time, a lot of Black Americans identified as Christian. Were they collecting things from Muslim populations or just Christian populations or even atheist texts? What were some of the ways in which they sort of collected materials?
That's a great question. And part of what was happening in this period, because the work was so unprecedented and because it was groundbreaking, is that there were no rules to follow, right? There was no set idea of what belonged, quote unquote, in a Black library or archive. And so all of these collectors and librarians were figuring out the answer to that question as they were going. And they were debating it and talking about it amongst themselves. And so the 6 collections that I write about, but the dozens more that I could have written about, they're all different from each other in one way or another. And you start to see some of the tensions around questions like that, right? What is proper material, right, for readers to have access to, right? Do you, and that can, the question of what's proper runs the gamut from, do you primarily chronicle achievements, or do you also chronicle the pain of the past, right? Do you only collect what might be called good literature, or do you collect, pulp fiction as well? There are those kinds of debates. But they also speak to kind of parameters of what constitute an idea of Black history or Black culture at the time. And so you'll see in Schomburg's collection, for example, he's very interested in the history of Islam in Africa. And so although there weren't a lot of printed books to collect, he had all the ones that there were. Lots and lots of documentation of Black Christianity as well, but you see his interest in the history of Islam. But he wasn't particularly interested in popular music, so there's no jazz or blues in that collection, right? Dorothy Porter was told by her superiors at Howard that they didn't want her to collect music. She understood the importance of collecting music for documenting Black history and culture, so she did it secretly. She would buy music and then just list it, along with the books in her library reports, and she knew that the folks reading those reports wouldn't be able to tell the difference in the titles, and so she got away with it. There's a chapter in the book on the scrapbook maker Alexander Gumby, who ran this queer, interracial, co-ed salon in the Harlem Renaissance, and he was really collecting the kind of irreverent, kind of more irreverent aspects of the culture, and his version of Black history, for example, is very, very queer, which Schomburg's certainly is not. So you can really see in the heterogeneity of these collections all of these competing ideas about what belonged in a Black archive, and that's what you want, actually, right? You want there to be an openness, right, about who can tell the story of the past and what those stories can encompass.
Is the head of Black Classics Press and the father of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he was instrumental in resurfacing the 1925 issue of Survey Graphic, which you can get from Black Classics Press, that has that article, "The Negro Digs Up His Past."
Yeah, thank you for that.
All right, thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Helton. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.